Hello and welcome to a new edition of Patria Grande, a production of ABC Latino Media Network. I am Enrique Rawlunski, and together with me today,
Pocho Salcedo.
a pleasure to have you once again here. And Pocho, in the last program of Patria Grande, we were talking about the 8 million native people from what is today Bolivia that perished in the silver mines once they were discovered in 1541. With a population nowadays, Bolivia, of just 10 million people, and only about 40% of native origin. Okay, but we want to touch today on what happened to this population so oppressed and so marginalized throughout the history from the 1500s onwards to the 21st century. Uh, how was that transformation, and what's the status of the originary peoples in the 21st century? So let's start with history. 1541, the discovery of the silver mines. What happens next throughout the centuries?
Well, as we discussed at one point, the mines to reach their potential at that time, because the lack of machinery, they need labor, and the labor is gathered by the Spaniards from the surrounding areas through a process of mita, which is like a mandatory service in the mines. That was one of the most extraordinary and dramatic parts of that part of history, because, as you related in our last conversation, many people died during the mita process. Even the parents of the young people who wanted to go there, when they saw that they were going to go eventually, they 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 did everything to their children so they would not participate
Yeah,
on that.
the accounts of the crown, the Spanish crown, is that mothers would kill their children just to avoid for them to go to work to the mines.
So
Tragic. So, but when is the first explosion, so to speak, where the native peoples rebel against this oppression and this extermination?
well, I think if we look from the point of view of the history being told by Latin Americans, the resistance to the Spanish colony and to that kind of actions started almost right away. And although the accounts were not that we were familiar with, were told by Spaniards themselves, there are many indigenous rebellions. And in this particular area, and we're talking about the late 1700s, where there is in Los Andes, in the area where Bolivia is now, uh, mm, concerted effort, led first by Tupac Amaru, indigenous leader, and then subsequently in a greater scale by Tupac Katari. Tupac Katari was in the 1770s, 1780s, was a recognized leader that gathered 40,000 warriors from different parts of small villages and so on, and they went and they surrounded. They tried to seal the city of La Paz, where was the place where the Spaniards were governing from, and they were unsuccessful in two opportunities. But in the second siege, they actually took this leader Tupac Katari and his wife Bartolina Sisa. At that time, women had among the indigenous people a pretty important role. For example, Juana Zurdu de
Juana
Padilla,
Surdu, of
you
course.
know, who was one of the persons that did so much for Argentina and for Bolivia for independence
Yes,
later on.
and you mentioned Juana Zurduy. She deserves her own chapter of Patria Grande for
Yes.
another opportunity because you are right. Women were always key in the independence of Latin American countries and in the governments from the time of the colonies
To
to
present.
today, to the present. Exactly.
It is amazing.
Right. And Tupac Katari ends up following the same death that Tupac Amaru, because once they are caught, he and his wife, they are tied to 4 horses from their extremities, and basically their corpses are destroyed in this way.
Exactly.
That's 1781, more or less.
But here's that part of the story which is dramatic. But here's the one thing that Tupac Katari says right before he's gonna be put to death. He says, "I die, but we will return tomorrow as thousands." And now we're gonna be talking about it because those were prophetic words. All the history, as you said, 200 years later, we see the real implementation
we
of
see
that.
a rebirth of the original people's culture in Bolivia.
Exactly.
Right? But in between, what happened in 1952? There was a revolution of sorts in there.
1952,
right?
there are like during that period of time, you see in the 1900s, the 1917, the Russian Revolution, then 1952, the Bolivian Revolution, which we're going to be talking about it, 1959, the Cuban Revolution. So we're shaking that part of the continent. In 1952, a group of young intellectuals leads a revolution that is very progressive and includes many indigenous people. And as a consequence of this revolution, they are allowed to have everybody in the country the right to vote. So when the indigenous people can vote, then the numbers start changing because the oligarchs don't have the numbers anymore. Democracy is what democracy should be: one person, one vote. And that creates also not only a seismic change, but also the incorporation of indigenous people that come vote. And there's the agrarian reform, which is a very important part. The land is reverted back to the original owners, which are the indigenous people, and the whole country changes. But this revolution, as it happens, gets through a number of changes, and then in the 1960s, 1964 actually, the military coup stops that progress, and then everything stops until the early 2000s.
The early 2000s. And it's interesting enough because by the year 2000, the indigenous people were once again marginalized in Bolivian society. And although they had the right to vote, we know that, as in many other parts and countries of Latin America, by the time that the elections come, nothing favors their participation. On the opposite, they are kept away from voting,
from the real decisions.
From the real decisions, they are. So the year 2000 finds them again immersed in poverty and away from being part of the decision-making process. And something interesting happens in the year 2001, 2003, 2005, which is called in Bolivian history as the water wars.
Correct.
What's that?
Well,
what is happening?
In Latin America, there's this tendency to privatize everything because the new official slogan is the public sector cannot do anything right, so everything should go to the private
sector. Exactly.
So banks are nationalized, privatized, railroads are privatized, and among those things, utilities are privatized. And in Bolivia,
and utilities mean natural resources.
Natural resources. So in Bolivia, the water system, especially in the city of Cochabamba, is privatized. A huge investment by Bechtel, and all of a sudden, the government, the people all realize they cannot afford water. And water is a natural right that everybody had access to. So here is a rebellion, a huge rebellion, that also is combined with Bolivia wanting to export natural gas, but Bolivia always had a very tense relationship with Chile.
Because Bolivia, let's remember our listeners, Bolivia is a country that doesn't have a coast anywhere. It's an inland country without access to the seas, and the only access to the sea is via Chile.
Which Chile took over about 780 miles of seacoast that Bolivia used to have. So that's why these tensions still exist. So what happened, the government decides that, okay, we're going to export gas via Chile, and that explodes the country. And a number of situations, the political class is pretty worn out by then, and there's the emergence of a union leader by the name of Evo Morales, and he, along with indigenous people, goes participates in a election, and
before we go to the election results and everything, what I find fascinating is how history presents us so many times with the confluence of factors that change everything from one moment to the next.
Exactly.
And this is one of those moments in the history of Bolivia, right? Because Evo Morales is of Aymara ascent.
Extraction, yes.
Let's remember Tupac Katari, also Aymara, and when he was before his execution, he says, "We'll come back as thousands." 250 years ago, Evo Morales, also from an Aymara origin. Yes. So the native people, I see that they come behind him, and he is a labor union, a labor leader, right? But it turns out that because of these wars for recovering the natural resources, the middle class also joins Evo Morales in his quest.
Yes. And what happens, Evo Morales wins one election, wins another election, not by small numbers, 51% in
54%.
the first, 54 and 61%, and he has popular support. And then he says one thing that's, I think, key to Evo Morales' success. He says, for 200 years, we have been patching a constitution that was formulated according to European principles that they never apply for us. So what we have to do, we have to reinvent the country. And the country goes through a total change in the way is represented, how the powers commingle, etc. And then Bolivia is refunded again as the plurinational state of Bolivia, where every ethnic group has a representation. That is the most important legacy, I believe, of Evo Morales.
And in his first and second governments, right, his cabinet, out of 16 members in the cabinet, 14 positions are filled with indigenous people.
That is the tip of the iceberg, because going down to every organization, ministries, you see mayor races, the House of Representatives, they are all have indigenous representation, which is pretty amazing. The whole thing changes. And Bolivia at that time also launched its first satellite. It's a communication satellite, and that satellite is called Tupac Katari. So really, even in technology, one voice becomes millions.
That's it. And it's rare indeed, but we see how the indigenous people retake their place in history and society. And for the first time, become creators of their own destiny. And I think that with this, we end up this edition of Patria Grande, a production of ABC Latino Media Network. And in the next edition, Pocho, what about we'll talk about how other extinct native people of South America,
how they went the other direction,
how they are rebirthed in the 21st century in a different way. Till the next time.